Containers are taking the industry by storm. In 2013, we ran the first container in Python thanks to Solomon Heights and Docker. After that, containers are everywhere, from desktop to laptop to cloud to on-prem data centers. Containers are vital piece of IT infrastructures. Hey, how you doing? This is Saim Safdar and you are listening to the CloudNative.fm podcast. In this show, we keep track of Cloud Native with Cloud Native experts. I'm excited and thrilled to host this show for you. This is episode number 19 of CloudNative.fm podcast. Today is June 8, 2021, and if you are loving containers and running that every day, then you are falling in love with Bret Fisher and his work in container ecosystem. And then I will bet you the next 1.5 hour is the best time in your life. We start off what is containers, why it is so popular. We run our first container thanks to Docker in 2013. After that, we have to deal with millions of containers every day. Then we see tools popping up like Docker, Docker Swarm, Docker Compose, and Kubernetes. Here's for our rescue. We discuss here containers, Docker, orchestration war between Docker Swarm and Kubernetes, why Kubernetes is adopted to cloud but Docker Swarm isn't. Where is Docker Swarm now? How Kubernetes distros came into being. Docker Swarm invented simplicity, which paves the way for others to success. Tools like K3s follow suit simplicity, which makes Kubernetes adoption hit skyrocketing. But sadly, this makes Docker Swarm hidden away in shadow. Let's travel back in time and unraveling the container story to learn the past, present, and future of containers with Bret Fisher. But first, let me introduce my guest. Bret Fisher is a Docker captain, host of Bret.live show weekly on Thursday on YouTube, author of bestseller courses on Udemy, Docker and Kubernetes Mastery, DevOps and Docker consultant, Udemy instructor, trainer, speaker, and open source volunteer working from Virginia Beach. Want to see what he is up to? Follow Bret on Twitter at Bret Fisher. And let's go ahead and say hi to Bret Fisher and cut it over to the interview.
Shutterstock Music. Shutterstock Music.
Thank you everyone for joining us, and today I'm really excited because I am waiting for this day to connect with Bret Fisher. I think already all of the people on the subcontinent side where I'm living, many of the people you already know him from Bret.live show, the DockerCon, and these are all he's a very popular and legendary figure in the container ecosystem, the Kubernetes community, the author of bestseller Kubernetes courses and Docker courses on Udemy. I think you all already know him. Thank you, Bret. How are you? And where you live. Can you introduce yourself to my audience? And thank you very much for being on the CloudNative.fm podcast.
Yeah, great domain, by the way. Good job. Hello, everyone. uh, I spend my days live on the internet, or maybe not live, making courses. But yeah, my name is Bret, and I do a lot of Docker and Kubernetes stuff. My whole career, 25 years or more, has been around helping developers get their software on the servers and keeping the servers up. So I'm mostly an operations person pretending to be a developer, but I spend my days when I'm consulting or whatever, just helping teams operationalize the software lifecycle. So we're just taking the code from developers, trying to test it better, trying to get it into production faster. And that led to DevOps, and eventually that led to containers. And, I found containers pretty early, like in late 2013, maybe early 2014, when it was right around the 1.0 days, and loved it. I started using it right away. I was very confused about how it worked. I did not understand all the magic. And over time, I just started teaching it to others and sharing what I knew. And I'm still doing that 8 years later. So
yes, definitely. And the first question before we jump into the container ecosystem and unfold the container history, can you introduce yourself to the audience? Because coronavirus and COVID-19 made ourselves containerized in the isolated for the larger community, and we are start boring inside the same room, living 24/7. So what you are doing in these coronaviruses and containerized environment ever since the corona started?
Yeah. So, sorry, what was the question again?
So what you are doing and what are your 1.5 year journey of the coronavirus?
Yeah.
How you spend time during the 24/7, not going elsewhere, just living inside the room and doing live stream.
Yeah. Got it. Okay. Mostly of the last year, because we've been able to take a break from real world conferences, because in 2018 and 2019, I traveled a lot, also in 2017, but it got to the point there where I was going to a conference almost every month. And I think in 2018, I spoke publicly, not on the internet, but in the real world, I spoke publicly about containers 2 times a month, all year long. So whether that was at meetups or at conferences or Docker events or something like that. So I really took the time to just stay at home and focused on easy stuff. So I actually tried to take a break a little bit, and I learned to play video games again, which I hadn't been playing in years. So I played games with my friends so that we could all see each other, and we would sit on headsets and chat while we were playing. And then with my courses, what ended up happening was I started focusing on getting more people into the live show, and then also consulting. So one of the things that I do is I swap back and forth between, like, 1 year I'll do speaking and consulting, and the next year I'll update all my courses, or I'll launch a new course. And then I go back and forth. And it's actually hard to do. But the thing for me is that I always want to feel like I'm not just teaching it because I read a book, but I'm teaching it because I've done it, and I do this on a day-to-day job. So I've always got to have one foot in the consulting world and helping customers actually implement this technology. Because that's really how I've always learned, is by doing. And so I'm not as good of a teacher unless I feel like I really know how a team uses this product, and I can give people advice on not just how it works, but how to use it properly, how not to use it. So last year, I spent a lot of time with that with consulting clients. I had 2 or 3 at least, and just implementing all this stuff and doing it in the real world.
Yes, definitely. I think I've seen you a lot of content, because I start introduced to the containers by watching your videos and having your content via Udemy, and it's been a wonderful content. Really appreciated your effort for putting on such a highly available, highly great content for our new beginners to dive into the container worlds. So
yeah, thank you.
So today, I think you are the best person for me to try to time travel a bit to understand where the containers are originated and what's
Yeah.
before the container. So let's jump into the 2013 when I think Solomon Hykes is giving a presentation on PyCon and he showed us how to run a container. So let's start from the 2013. What's happening in 2013 in the container ecosystem?
Yeah. So before Docker, before the project was released to the public, like you were mentioning, there was already companies using container tools. The thing that Docker really did was we've had in Linux especially, but in other Unix platforms, BSD has concepts of jails. That's actually Solaris. We had chroot. We had all these different ideas of how to limit a user's scope or how to make someone think that they have root on a server when they really don't. They might just be a tiny little user with a tiny little directory of files, but we make them think they're root and they can have that little slice of the machine. So we've had that idea for decades, but it wasn't until the late half of the 2000s and then early 2010s where the Linux features started showing up, C groups and namespaces specifically. Those features showed up in the kernel, and it allowed companies like Netflix and Google and these other really big companies that have tons and tons of smart people, they were able to figure out how to do that so that they could run, for example, 3 different versions of Python side by side in 3 different isolated environments on the same server. And they could do that with all their built-in tooling. Well, mere mortals like myself, we didn't have that tooling. So a lot of us were still using what I call VM-based isolation. So we're using the entire operating system in a virtual machine as the isolation layer. So you might have one VM for your database and then one for your PHP web server. And that's how we kind of would bring things together, is we use the VM as the way to encapsulate our applications. And we usually, when we would grow by adding more VMs and put one app on each VM, and away we went. So that's how AWS was kind of designed, in fact, in the early days of EC2, was to do it with that. And we had auto-scaling abilities with all those machines, but it was really expensive, and we still had lots of idle CPUs. So we were all still just most of our computers, I think the average was like 80% of CPU cycles are idle, even though we're paying for them, we're not using them. So Docker took all those container ideas and they were using it in their a company that they were running at the time called .cloud. It was kind of like Heroku. And they had a startup that they were building all this tooling to manage their cloud. So they were building a cloud for people to run apps on. And they took a lot of that tooling and wrapped it up and called it Docker and made what was previously really complex to do with the Linux kernel and a bunch of different utilities. They made it a very easy, we all now know Docker run, right? And that Docker run in the background did lots of things. So Docker, when they launched, I basically tell people there's 3 major things they did that they innovated on. One is they gave us the idea of a container, and they wrapped all up these features of Linux. And that's what we think of when we think of Docker, is that they made the container, the modern container, as will call it, the modern idea of container. But they really had 2 other things that they created too. They created the idea of an image, and an image is a read-only copy of your application in the Docker file as you built it. And the key is it's read-only. Once the image is built, it is hashed with SHA-256, so it's guaranteed to be identical on each machine. They invented that idea. So now today we call it the OCI image spec, but that's essentially the second thing they created. And the third one, then I'll shut up, the third one is the registry. So they came up with the idea of this place that we can store these images and move them around, and they use an HTTPS protocol. So it's nice and easy, API-based, HTTP-based, so it works with all firewalls. It works inside of data centers. It's easy to move things around. And because of that image with the read-only SHA hash, we were guaranteed that the one I built on my machine would be the exact same bit-for-bit copy that would be in the registry and then on my server. And when they put all that together, that's how we're able to just do Docker run Python on our machine, and it silently in the background downloads it from the internet, stores it on my machine, and then makes a new container from that image. And that all happens in seconds now. But really, that was those three major innovations in 2013 that kind of blew us all away, and that we're still using today in all the container tools.
Yes, definitely. I think the one thing, the idea of the container, because before the container you have some kind of VM, and yet then you hypervise the operating system that you can run multiple OSs on top of one virtual machine. But at the end of the day, you need the operators to patch and update those virtual machines and operating system, and that is really complex. And it consumes a lot of memory, and you end up running a tiny app, let's say the Nginx apps on top of the virtual machine. Yes, you hypervises that. So the container came up.
Yeah.
You have some image there. You can run it. You can remove it. Then you restart it. Then you remove it. So it's kind of a very smooth journey for the developer, especially. I think developer needs some kind of simplicity in their environment. So that is 2013. And then we go to the 2014, we see a Google came up with some orchestration engine, and they make it open source to the public, and they call it Kubernetes. So what's happening in the 2014?
Yeah, so what happened was people were running Docker everywhere. Like we were running Docker, it was an instant hit, right? So even by the time it was 1.0 in 2014, companies like Google were already trying to figure out, okay, if we're going to run Docker on 100 servers, and they were trying to, well, who's going to manage all 100 servers, right? Who's going to automate all of those? And Kubernetes was something that came out of an internal project at Google called Borg that is essentially what they use to run Google. But they knew when they launched it to the rest of the world that, one, they just couldn't take all their internal code and dump it on the internet. It wouldn't make sense for most people. So they tried to create a smaller project with a smaller idea. I think the original version was actually in Bash, the very first release by those first few team members. And then they rewrote it in Go language, and they called it Kubernetes to kind of, it's a whole thing about Seven and Star Trek stuff. So you can go look it up on the internet. But the idea there is that it's going to give us the ability to have a single command line control of all these Docker engines on all these servers from one place. And that was really, it basically was this, we had too many Dockers. And so Kubernetes had to be born. At the same time, of course, Docker is releasing their own idea. And we have, at this point, a bunch of different ideas. There's Docker Swarm Classic, which was prior to the more modern Docker Swarm mode. We had Mesos, which was kind of doing their own thing with containers and running other types of workloads. We had something called Nomad come out that's still around from HashiCorp. And I think there was probably 3 or 4 others that I've already forgotten about. But there was a lot of ideas about, okay, Docker's fantastic. We want to run it everywhere. But how do we control everything from one place? You know?
Yes, definitely. I think Jerome Petazzoni has been on the podcast previously. I think he's one of the very few, one of the very first few 7% who joined Docker. So they asked me, when we came up with the Docker, we really think about how we move this thing to the production and how it's going to work there. Or then we see the Kubernetes came up. Then we gave the idea. Now how this thing is actually going to work, and it's worked very perfectly with the Kubernetes and these kind of setup. And then they start thinking about why not we can bring their own orchestrator. We build containers. Why not we have some of our own orchestrators there? Then the discussions start inside the Docker to build some kind of, the Docker Swarm came up. I think its first version came up in 2016.
That's right. That's right.
2016. So, but before we go into the 2016, what's happening in the 2015 as well? What are the in the container ecosystem? What happening there, and how is Docker Swarm came up in 2016?
Yeah. Well, at this point, so Docker is now evaluated somewhere around that timeline as like they're basically another what we call a unicorn in the startup space. They're about to be evaluated as over $1 billion or worth over $1 billion American dollars, and that put them in a space where basically they were able to start acquiring companies and just spin out every idea that they possibly have for how to use Docker. No one's really sure yet exactly how they're going to make money. So they've got a bunch of money that they've been given to run. They've got some investors, And so we start to see them do things like they take the compose, we call it Docker Compose today, but it was called Fig back then. And right around this time, they basically acquire the Fig project, turn into what they call Docker Compose. And now, and today we can talk about later, now Docker Compose is being integrated into the Docker client itself. I call it Docker Space Compose, not Docker Dash Compose. But anyway, that was a way on how do I run multiple containers locally with a single command all at the same time. And instead of Docker run, it now becomes Docker Compose up. At the same time, they launch Docker Hub and they add on some features to Docker Hub. They buy this company called Tudum, and that company turns into more features in Docker Hub. You can actually start spinning up servers with Docker Hub, which they no longer do. They don't have Docker Cloud anymore, but they had Docker Cloud for a while. At the same time, like you mentioned, the Swarm Classic idea was about to come out, and there was talks of, is Docker going to come out with some sort of enterprisey thing, right? We haven't seen anything from him yet at this point, but yeah, we're seeing all sorts of action in the community, and Docker's spinning out new projects left and right.
Yes, definitely. I think in the year from 2016, we see the Kubernetes has Docker code built in it. And the very interesting story that I heard from people, the Docker came up this idea, modernizing their traditional app into the microservices architecture. But in itself, Docker in itself is a giant monolith. Even the Docker Swarm code is built into the Docker, and then the Kubernetes Kubernetes is acquired the Docker code. They have some own orchestrator there, Docker Swarm. So they are thinking about what's happening there. We are competing with the orchestrator, but we have a code for the Docker Swarm there. So can you introduce these ideas of what's in 2016, how we call the refactoring of the Docker code is going on at the same time?
Yeah, that's true. And largely, most of this stuff doesn't actually matter today. But the problem with the internet is that everything we've written and everything we've put in video, it's around forever. So yeah. So you see a 5-year-old blog post talking about Docker Swarm, just ignore it. But but back in 2016, Docker's approach has always been to take the 20% of the features that we all need, that 80% of it need. It's the 80-20 rule. They take 20% of the features that we all need, most of us need at least, and they try to bundle them in a super easy way. There are people that don't like that, and they would much prefer a more manual approach, more of a maybe Unix origin approach, where you have small utilities, they do one thing, they do it well, where Docker was more of bundling in all these different utilities into one single command line. So at the time, they were experimenting with something with Docker Swarm. They created a new built-in swarm called Swarm Mode. It's still there today. The internals of it, the library is called SwarmKit. And at the same time, Kubernetes is starting to gain a lot of traction. It doesn't quite have mainstream traction in the clouds. The clouds aren't really even sure how to deal with it yet. They're not sure if they want to host it. But Kubernetes has such a huge presence that once Docker, and remember, at this point, Docker is still being used by Kubernetes. So we actually, at this point, this is when I start learning about Kubernetes, and I realized that step one, Kubernetes doesn't run containers. The only thing Kubernetes does is it manages container runtimes, and then those things run the containers. Now, we all tend to forget about that, but that's still true today. And at that time, Docker was continuing to bundle more and more stuff into Docker, because that's what its approach is small, or an easy one-shot kind of thing. It does it all. It does everything you need in one little utility. But Kubernetes doesn't want all of that, because Kubernetes is doing a lot of that for you in Kubernetes. It doesn't need more features out of Docker. It just needs Docker to stay the same. So at the same time, Docker releases something called Moby, and it's basically Docker's attempt to give the open source to the community that they don't necessarily want people to think this is Docker and we are the ones that control it, and you don't have any say in it. So they kind of split the code out a little bit, and they say, okay, we still got the Docker engine, Docker command line, but the underlying code is going to be in something called Moby. And then they have these other things called kits. We got build kit, swarm kit. There's a couple other kits. There's VPN kit. There's a bunch of things. And those are all libraries, just like Moby. They're the underlying open source that they kind of wanted to give to the community. So they create this thing called the Moby project.
The 2017, the year, so we have right now Docker Swarm came up. We have talked about the Docker Compose and these all kinds of version came up. Docker Swarm, Kubernetes, I think they have the head-to-head and toe-to-toe battle in comparison to their service-to-service and feature-to-feature comparison. And Docker Swarm is people are talking about all the time. There is so much ton of the content available on the internet, and Kubernetes came up, gradually shifting its focus toward them. So what's happening inside the 2017 era? What are the different competitors of the orchestrator was then?
Well, I think that we all got distracted with what now we call the orchestrator wars, where Docker won the container war. They're in software, we all want a winner, just like we want in all things, right? Even though in reality, we all use different things, right? Right now, you and I are probably talking across many different operating systems between our computers. There's Windows, Mac, and Linux. All are now winners. They all have their ecosystem. And so in 2017, I was that guy sort of saying, we have Kubernetes, that's great. It's for complex teams. It's for operations. It's designed for operators, not for developers to maintain and build. And it was way back then, it was much more complex to install. So if you found me on the internet from 2017, I was probably complaining about Kubernetes, that it was tough to install and manage, even if you're a full-time operator like myself. If you're a developer who doesn't spend their time in servers and operating systems and understanding networking distributed systems at a low level, Kubernetes could be quite frustrating. You had to care about certificates and locking down ports and RBAC, all these permission things. And Swarm presented this wonderful, Docker stack deploy kind of experience, a single command to install all of your stuff. I'll run all your containers and create all the secrets and all the configs. So in 2017, some of us, a small portion of us, were very bullish that Swarm had an audience, that what I now call the solo DevOps, the person who is responsible for the infrastructure, and they're the only person that has to do that. So they don't have a team of people to lean on. They have to do it all themselves. And I loved Swarm for that. I ran many Swarm clusters for myself and my clients around this time, 2017. But we can all kind of see the pace at which Kubernetes is not just adding new features and adding new functionality, but the marketplace has figured out that Kubernetes is where they can maybe hitch their wagon and make some money, where Swarm was more even though it was open source, these are all open source things, the way that Docker presented Swarm, because it was a built-in feature, the ecosystem didn't really see how they could complement it and make money, right? So the challenge with a lot of this stuff is open source is great, but ultimately, if you want to get the ecosystem behind you, there's got to be a way there for them to make money on it. And Kubernetes, at first, I can remember listening to podcasts in 2017, 2018, where even analysts were still predicting that we don't see how companies are going to make money on Kubernetes because it's reasons, but because Google was behind it, but Google wasn't, they weren't offering support for it or anything. Docker was offering support for Swarm, and you could pay for it with their enterprise stuff. So there was a lot of predictions. Ultimately, at the end of the day, now it's 5 years later, 3 years later, we're all using Kubernetes. Some of us are still using Swarm, but even those that are using Swarm are still using Kubernetes because now Kubernetes is everywhere. One of the things that happened in that 2017 timeframe was we started to see the infrastructure companies start to announce that they were going to have a distribution of Kubernetes that they were either going to give away, they were going to sell a distribution. Cloud provider creating a Kubernetes hosted solution where they set it up for you. They implemented the security and the patching and the updating. And so that's where the value of Kubernetes presented itself at first to the community was, oh, Kubernetes is so complex, we'll make money on making it less complex. Swarm was already so easy, So even, years later, we still have people just installing a swarm with a single command after they've installed Docker, and then they deploy their app with a single command, and it's still that easy. What we started to see when we hopped to 2018 is Kubernetes continues to make pace. More cloud vendors are jumping on board. We have more distributions. I think at peak we had 100 different distributions of Kubernetes. And when I say distributions, when you think of Linux, most of us don't custom build our own Linux today. We don't manually install the generic kernel and then manually install drivers and services and manually set up, system D. We don't all do that now. We usually just download a distribution. But there wasn't that long ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, a lot of us were building our own kernels. And, back before we had Ubuntu, back before we even had Fedora, all these things, we had to manage a lot of our own stuff just to get Linux running. Now it's just an easy, almost plug and play world. And everyone almost uses a distribution except for those that run the Googles and run the Netflixes and that sort of thing. So the same thing is happening with Kubernetes, where now in 2017, 2018, there's a huge amount. Every vendor has their own distribution. Even storage vendors have a distribution of Kubernetes, and they're packaging it up. So they provide the install, they provide the security layers, they provide the defaults for networking and storage and stuff like that. And that's where we kind of are starting to see that, okay, this is like a lot of other tools that have really taken over the landscape of infrastructure. This is how Kubernetes is going to be used. Most people will not do what we call Kubernetes vanilla or the upstream open source GitHub Kubernetes. Most people might learn with that, but they're really just going to install a distribution, whether it's the cloud provided one or it's Red Hat or it's Rancher, Mirantis, VMware. They all these companies have their own distribution. And that's how we look fast forward, we now see that that's how most people have done it. So yeah.
Yes, definitely.
That was kind of 2017, 2018.
Yes, definitely. I think I talked about in the podcast with some Kelsey Hightower and other guys with as well. I think one of the podcasts I talked with Jerome Patazzoni is a number for the very few guys who work for the Docker. I think at the start they're thinking about how this thing works in the production. They're waiting that the Docker Swarm came up, that the Kubernetes came up. I think 2017 is a year most of the people are talking about. The Kubernetes community and the people behind the Kubernetes, they want to see what the people's reactions are. So they're waiting to see, because Docker Swarm is becoming the popular because it's a simpler, you have some run of one single command, the whole cluster is built up, and developers really like about this feature, and you don't need any kind of the services integration for the DNS discovery, so that Docker Swarm made it so easy. Behind the curtain, everything happens to you. It's built the orchestration layer and you are up and running. So at that point, a Docker Swarm is gradually gaining the momentum, but Kubernetes is learning from their community. What's happened? What are the other features people like about it? So I think in that time period, they are looking forward to make their Kubernetes API so granular, so everybody can integrate their third-party solution into that, and they can work with it seamlessly. Where the Docker Swarm is kind of a developer and friendly focus there in the 2017. And I think when we jump to the 2018 world, I think we see some managed services coming up, like GKE. I think they are the first one who announced the GKE managed services come up. And then people are thinking about, now Kubernetes is in the cloud, but Docker Swarm is not there. And then I think gradually gaining the momentum of adoption of Kubernetes increasing day by day in 2018. So let's discover what the managed services are compared to the Docker Swarm and other orchestration layers in 2018.
Yeah, one of the things that I talk about with Swarm was that it was so easy to implement for what I would say 50 or less servers. It was so easy to implement that the clouds and the vendors they could not come up with value for managing your deployment. Docker made it so easy. It was secure by default. There was no way to create a swarm on an up-to-date version of Docker. If you just apt-get install Docker and then you Docker swarm init, you essentially had a properly TLS encrypted, mutually authenticated cluster that was already protected, but it didn't have a lot of the things people need. It didn't have role-based authentication, or role-based access control, rather. It didn't have authentication at all built in. And so you started to see tools like Portainer, which is still around, provide a lot of this extra functionality. Swarm also was blend Swarm with add more functionality. There was a lack of options in the storage and networking space, so it came with some defaults, but they weren't great. So a lot of people wanted to use other things, and there wasn't a lot of stuff out there. We've made a networking option that was more or less the same as what was built in, but it gave you a few extra features. And so what we started to see with Kubernetes was that because the ecosystem saw that they could hitch a ride essentially and make money, create products, and you need that in a healthy software ecosystem. You sometimes need that with these commercial products, where Swarm didn't really present that on its first iteration. At the same time, Docker is still, as a company, still trying to make money, still trying to be profitable. So they're still trying to figure out where should they focus their money-making people on. And at the time, they were thinking it was on selling enterprise orchestration. So they were doing Swarm. Around this time in 2018, they announced Swarm and Kubernetes coming in their Docker Enterprise version. So they were the only orchestrating company that you could sort of start out with an easy, small Swarm on them. You just add it with a couple of clicks. That won't really pan out, but it was sort of an evolution for people that eventually we will all be used to Kubernetes, and so it won't be such a big deal to manage and implement Kubernetes. But I think in 2017 was still very new to people. Even today, there's tons of people taking my Kubernetes courses. Every day there's 100 plus people that sign up for it. And so idea of an orchestrator, and Kubernetes and Swarm are very, very similar that way in how they're managed, what services are, how do you deploy containers. And so I think 2018 was sort of where we got at stable Kubernetes versions. We got vendors that have a ton of products that you can add on to Kubernetes. And the excitement or the discussion around which one won, I'm going to put that in air quotes because it really, what is a winner, right? By one. But what I think I was then there were Swarm was reducing in a number of people using it. It's being outpaced by the sheer number of people implementing Kubernetes. I think that it really is sad that Swarm never was adopted by a cloud company. But I sort of make the argument that if one of the reasons you want Swarm is because it's so easy to implement and maintain, but if the cloud is doing that for you on Kubernetes, then you've kind of no longer have the argument for why you shouldn't run Kubernetes. Because if the infrastructure is auto updated and it's a one-click button to implement and they're managing the security and your API endpoint and all that stuff, then a lot of the argument for why you might want to try Swarm goes away. At somewhere in the 2018, 2019 timeframe, it was just so apparent that there were no more third-party tools really coming to Swarm, and every company in the DevOps space, every development company was throwing Kubernetes on their front page, right? Like every front page of the website was like, we are now a Kubernetes blah, blah, blah. Like who cares what they made? It was now for Kubernetes. And that kind of messaging power was so prevalent that I think it's almost like, regardless of the reality of how many people were using Kubernetes, the marketing and chatter made it seem that everyone was using it. And so then everyone used it. And in fact, today, you now have people that are using Kubernetes who don't know why they're using Kubernetes. They don't know why they chose it. Why do they even need it? Around this time, I think a lot of us that were teaching figured out that people were really hoping, developers especially, because Docker was always a developer-focused company, but developers were really hoping that Docker could be the one tool. I write my code, I have my editor, I have the frameworks, I have to know all my frameworks, my package manager, I have to know all these things. And then I just want one tool to package, test, and deploy, right? They were thinking that Docker could be that tool. And in 2015 and 2016, that it was. If you were just running one or two servers with Docker, that's all you needed was Docker. But once we all got to a dozen servers, and every server that we were using now in our company was Dockered, the problem is that Docker didn't solve that problem, didn't solve the management problem. And so you would then need Kubernetes, which I think disappointed a lot of us because we were not really wanting another complex tool. A lot of us came out of the, a lot of other infrastructure tooling spaces. I'm not going to name all the names, but there's been tons of infrastructure automation companies, infrastructure management tools, and that world is inherently very complex. And we were kind of hoping that maybe that's the past. Maybe we don't need all that complexity, that if we just standardize on containers, that the pipeline of tooling and deployment can be really simple. Well, we like to take things that are easy and make them hard again. So I think that we're now in a world where if you go to 2019 was where Docker splits the company and they sell off all their enterprise assets. So this is a pivotal year for Docker. And the only thing left in Docker out of 400 plus employees is less than 100 employees and just the open source. There's a little few bits there that they technically got back and then they open sourced them, but really it's just the open source. So that includes Docker Desktop, Docker Engine, Docker CLI, Docker Compose, Docker Swarm, and so all the developer tooling, but all of their server tooling, so the Docker Enterprise, the DTR, their Docker Enterprise Registry, all those things go to Mirantis, which is traditionally actually a Kubernetes company, but they basically bought the customers. There was over 700 customers, most of them on Swarm at this point. So they get all these customers, they get all the engineering staff, the support staff, the sales staff for enterprise stuff. Docker is now, as of late 2019, again, like they were originally, a developer-focused company that is not focused on orchestration. They're not going to be putting any more effort internally into Swarm, and they still haven't. 2 years later, it's still there, but it's maintained by Mirantis externally, and then Docker just updates Docker with the latest version of Swarm whenever they ship it. So technically Swarm isn't dead, but at this point it's only an external vendor and only a few people in that company that are working on it. They're still adding features slowly and surely. But as of 2019, that's kind of where it was left is, well, I hate to say that we put the last nail in the coffin of Swarm, but because the reality is it hasn't changed. It actually is the same tool it was then. It's just as good as it was then, but everyone else has moved on. Every other tool has gotten better and added more features, but Swarm really hasn't. So I think a lot of us are just looking at it as still a good tool, but we've all learned and matured and expect more. And that's when sort of the consensus is, yeah, you probably shouldn't implement Swarm in a company. I still use it for personal use all the time, like on a single server or 2 servers, 3 servers, something like that. I'll use it. But when you're in the cloud, or if you're building out a company's business, if you're making money on your servers and that's what runs the business, then nowadays everybody's recommending Kubernetes for managing many servers. If you still only have one server, you still don't need Kubernetes, which I think will be true for a long time. Kubernetes is still very heavyweight. It uses a lot of CPU when nothing is happening. It's still using a lot of memory CPU compared to Docker and Swarm, and it's still fairly complex to run yourself. But 2019 is when Docker is now essentially Docker Hub and Docker Desktop. And what the weird thing is in 2019 is that Docker quietly tells everyone that they don't really expect a lot of people to run Docker on their servers anymore. Now, it still works great on servers all day long, but they're not focused on production operations stuff. They're focused on developer workflow, right? So now we're in 2020. We're 3 months, 4 months after the sale of most of Docker's enterprise assets, and then basically the only thing they have now that makes money is Docker Hub. And Docker is going back to their roots and building on Docker Desktop. They're rapidly adding new features to Docker Desktop. And if you remember, I don't know if you're sure if you're a WSL2 guy, but WSL2 comes out and there's this new fancy functionality for WSL2, which is still great.
Yes, definitely. I think the one thing, I think we draw a point on one thing before moving that. I think in the 2018, 2017, people are really confused about that. Docker Swarm 2017 is hit the ground up. 2018 is gradually slow. 2019 is now selling all of its major product. The competitions that we are everybody talking about is now selling all its products to, I think, Mirantis, and Mirantis acquiring all the business part of the Docker, and Docker is now left with just open source. So just people are thinking, many of the people really confused about it. Those people who are interested in running their businesses, they're really confused. What just happened there within the 1 year that we see a whole drop shift from Docker is so being a popular, and now it's left with very few tools that they already have. But many of the people are praising Docker efforts. They give us a container, they give us a Docker Swarm, they talk about the orchestrations layer, they talk about many simplicity. And Docker is way simpler for many of the people right now. You just run Docker and the container blows up, Docker Compose. And I think most of the people, many of the people are really appreciated the effort of Docker, and now just shifting their focus to developer, because the developer, the first person who loved the Docker a lot. And I think on the topic of this, one thing I think we don't like mention right now, because I think with the 2018, 2019, we see the Rancher's Kubernetes engine, the K3S, and these are types of things are originated that give the extra boost to Kubernetes. So can you introduce to our audience what these distributions are, what the RKE, what the K3S does, and why it's got so popular, and many of the people are just motivating from the Rancher's success stories of managing these Kubernetes distributions?
Yeah. But Kubernetes, well, first off, Rancher is a great company, and I'm big fans of theirs. And I've had him on my show several times, Darren Shepard, and I look at them and I see them as they can sort of see and predict where things are going and then fill the gaps with excellent little free tools. And they're an entirely open source company. Whereas, Docker had a lot of open source, but then they started to go into the closed source stuff with their Docker Enterprise before 2019 when they sold it. And so Rancher is filling the gap. And they had previously had Rancher 1.0, which was a orchestrator that they had actually built. And then you could actually use it with Swarm and other things. So they had their own orchestrator as well. And it was a web utility with a bunch of management and installation stuff. And they created their own container OS that no longer really is used. And they even created their own storage platform called Longhorn. And so they're kind of filling the gaps where they see the major players not providing great open source. And people start to love them because they're making great open source. It's not open source that is sort of arbitrarily limited to force you to buy something else, right? And that's a struggle. And when companies are trying to figure out how to make money on open source, it's not easy. And so sometimes the strategy will be, well, we'll give you a limited edition for free. Well, and Rancher as a company doesn't do that, much like HashiCorp in a lot of ways, where they say, no, we're going to give all the software away. If you want to pay for support, you can. And so their company is entirely support driven in terms of their revenue model, which means their software is naturally unlimited in its functionality. Like they'll add the best features and the best ideas that people give them, regardless of whether they could possibly have made money on it. So that creates a loyal open source following. People in open source love that kind of approach. There's lots of successful companies that have done a support only profit model. And they shift in Rancher 2.0 around this time to only supporting Kubernetes as their orchestrator. And so that's a sort of another sign that they don't think that it's worth supporting all these other orchestrators in terms of their tooling. They really just want to focus on the biggest and best one with the most flexibility, especially for them because they're building tools on top of the orchestrator. They need that solid API that Kubernetes provides that maybe some of the other tools didn't. So they announced Rancher 2.0, but Rancher 2.0 is still a heavyweight product. It's still got its own deployment tool, and it's still got its own web interface, and then you still have to run Kubernetes. So it's actually adding even more stuff to the complex Kubernetes deployment. And so Darren Shepard, who's actually a Swarm fan, when Swarm was still a thing that we all were using, he was actually a very big proponent of the way that Swarm deployed, and it was lean and very minimal. So he created something called K3S, or you might hear of as K3s or keys. There's 3 different ways you could say it, at least. And there is, last I checked, no opinion on the official word, on the right way to say it. So I'm going to say K3S. And on K3S, he took the actual source code of Kubernetes, the main API and the main other functionality that you get out of the box with a vanilla install. And he bundled it all together, and he removed a lot of the unnecessary stuff, because early days Kubernetes, there was a lot of third-party storage drivers and things that were bundled into the original source code that you may never use. If you wanted to install it on a Raspberry Pi or on a couple of servers in your closet or something, you would probably never need S3 storage drivers or Azure storage drivers or any of these things. So he removes a bunch of the unnecessary, whittles it down to just the bare minimum, and they call it K3S, implying that it's less than K8S, which we all see as the acronym for Kubernetes. So in other words, it's smaller. And it doesn't necessarily make it easier to deploy your apps on, because we're all still going to have to use Manifest, but it makes it less resource intensive, which means you can now run it reasonably on a Raspberry Pi or an ARM device or IoT things. And that really speaks to a lot of people,
Yes, definitely. And I think the K3S gave us the new things of running Kubernetes in many of the different places, like IoTs. People are talking about the Kubernetes has so many things that IoTs also needed. Like one of the IoTs goes down, who has a responsibility to back up another IoTs. So I think you can run now Kubernetes in many edge devices. So I think that's Rancher gave us to the community. But I think in the same year, for 2018, 2019, we all see the new shift in the market, the IT market came up. That's called the GitOps. We always used to talking about DevOps, SRE, but the new terminology is coined by the WeWork team. And most of the people think it just works with Kubernetes, than the GitOps things. But I think the GitOps it also evolves, and the Kubernetes gain more and more popularity, more and more tooling around that. 2020 is this year that we see so many other distribution coming up, like K0S from the Mirantis came up, and other these kind of distribution there. But first, you can talk about what the GitOps is, what their methodologies are, and on top of that, one other thing. In 2020, we see a Kubernetes, I think 1.19 release or 1.20. They are drawing the Docker shim removes from the Kubernetes, and everybody talking about what that is. Docker is deprecating.
Yeah.
There's a lot of confusion around that. But first, let's just focus with what the GitOps is and how it's introduced to the community.
Well, GitOps, that's GITOPS, really is not something that is new to Kubernetes, but we never really had a word for it. And we've all probably heard of infrastructure as code, which is the idea that you can describe your infrastructure in some sort of configuration language, often YAML, but not always, maybe JSON, maybe TOML, maybe something else. And that you can run something, run a command, and then your infrastructure will become what you intended it to be. So it's usually a little bit declarative in style, not necessarily imperative, where we're used to saying, like, create me one server, create me two server, create me a third server. That's imperative style. Declarative is like, here's everything I want. You figure out how to give it to me. And GitOps was an extension or taking that to the next level and saying, well, because Kubernetes itself is essentially a differencing engine, in that it looks at the manifest you give it, and then it looks at what it's running, and then it makes sure that they're the same. And so that's why Kubernetes is always busy, even when it's idle, even when you're not using it for anything. It's always busy checking to make sure what you've asked it to do and what it's currently doing, whether it's one server or 1,000 servers, are always the same. That's essentially what Kubernetes does. And GitOps says, well, let's do that same thing for infrastructure, and let's add tools to Kubernetes so that Kubernetes can manage this for us. So now we can have tools that you can store your YAML or your configuration data, you can say, inside of Git. Now we say GitOps, but it could be any version system, but we all use Git nowadays anyway, so GitOps. And so you put it there, you install something like Flux or Argo CD inside of your Kubernetes cluster, and now Kubernetes, instead of you telling it, hey, check my manifest here manually, now it's checking the Git repo all the time for any changes. It might use webhooks. It might do something where it looks for new image versions automatically in your Docker registry, and then automatically deploys them if they update. It might do all this. It's doing it automatically. And the idea is that it's declarative in nature. So you're telling it what you want, and it's its job to keep it the way you intended. And that's good.
Yeah, definitely. And the next question, I think, what's in 2020, we see the Kubernetes is deprecating at 1.20. I think that's creating a whole lot of confusion in the Kubernetes and Docker community. And everybody talking about the best way to think about this is don't panic, because there's not a lot going to change in there. But we think about the deprecation of the Docker shim and run C part of it. So I think the whole lot of confusion going on, and I think I remember that you could, on the same day when the Kubernetes announced the Docker shim removal from the Kubernetes, you did a show with, I think, Justin Cormack, and you just told us there's not a lot going to change in there, and it's a confusion how Docker works under the hood. And Kubernetes is not a human. It don't need some kind of fancy UI for that. It just need to run the container, and the container D is good for that. I think you did a show on that. So what this in 2020 is removal part of it. Everybody's got confused. What just happened there?
I'd say for 98% of people, this doesn't mean anything. Even people that run Kubernetes, this isn't news. It became news only because Kubernetes originally, when it was created in very early days of Docker. It was actually launched at DockerCon. It was a way to manage multiple Docker installs on many servers. That was the idea for Kubernetes. And Docker kept adding more features, as they should have. And Kubernetes didn't need all of those because it was building those same features for multi-server orchestration, where Docker was building it for single server. So Docker around 2016, 2017 timeline, they created a project called Containerd. And Containerd was the idea of taking the guts out of Docker itself, out of the engine, and making them a standalone binary so that Docker itself, as well as Kubernetes or any other provider that wanted to use the core underlying principles, the base stuff of how to start a container, what does it mean to create a container, creating the storage location, the layers of an image, how do I download an image, those kind of basic things. So I put all that into Containerd, and so by 2020, Containerd was now the second most popular way to run containers in Kubernetes. Because again, we talked about this earlier, Kubernetes doesn't itself run containers. It manages container runtimes, Docker being the most popular. And Docker still has more features than any other container runtime, like it can build images. Containerd and CRI-O can't, which CRI-O and Containerd are the two other most popular ones, besides Docker. So Docker still has a superset of functionality, But because Kubernetes now has a specification for how it intends the runtimes to work, and Docker predates that, Docker didn't want to just change Docker itself to conform to Kubernetes API. So there's always been this thing in the middle known as the Docker shim. And that translates the Kubernetes API calls into what Docker's engine would allow. So it's not a huge amount of code, but it is something that has to be maintained. And essentially in 2020, the announcement from the Kubernetes team was, hey, we've been maintaining this now for 5 years. We don't want to anymore because we've got so much other stuff to maintain. And now we have good things like Containerd and CRI-O, which don't need it because shim was specifically for the Docker engine, which at this point, Docker engine's great. Everyone still uses it on their local machine, but it's maybe not the best thing in Kubernetes where you want minimal binaries that are small as possible and only do the little thing they're supposed to. So they announced the deprecation of the shim, and that basically they're just telling us, hey, go use Containerd. This Containerd is maintained partly by Docker, who invented it. Containerd is today used by Docker. Whenever you run a Docker command, you're running Docker engine, which then runs Containerd, which runs something else that we all don't really know about, but it's something called runc, which is technically the little thing that actually creates your container. So we have lots of abstractions. And I think the messaging gets lost initially that somehow Docker is no longer compatible or that you can't, there's none of that is true. It's simply, these are all standards. They're all conforming to the way an image is built. That's called the OCI standard. So everything's going to run images the same. Everything is going to create and run containers the same. Docker has slightly different features than CRI-O and then Containerd, and Containerd has slightly different features than others. But for 95% of people, they would never know that. Also, when you use a Kubernetes distribution, and you should, almost all Kubernetes distributions pick their own runtime. So it's not your choice. So in other words, they're managing it for you. Kind of like buying a car. We all expect tires on the car when we buy it. Whoever is buying a new car, manufacturer picks tires. We don't pick the tires after we buy the car, right? So, this analogy would be the same way for container. When you get a container, when you get a Kubernetes distribution like VMware, Rancher has their own instructions, their own preferences and settings for how you should do your container runtimes. So that's really what you should look at. Ignore the Kubernetes statement from upstream Kubernetes open source. You're really caring about your vendors' preferences and which runtimes they prefer and which settings they allow, and which things they support. And that didn't really change any. The industry was already slowly moving to Containerd as the primary runtime. Well, funny thing is 6 months later, well, not even 6 months, weeks later, weeks after that announcement, Mirantis, remember the company that bought most of Docker, just put out an announcement that says, hey, they're going to now support the Docker shim. So that announcement essentially became null and void because a vendor now says they're going to basically create a copy of that. They're going to fork that code. They're going to maintain it. And they have been. They've created a shim. And so if you still want to use Docker today, underlying Kubernetes, the biggest reason you might want to do that is because you want your Kubernetes servers to also build images inside the Docker container runtime. That, by the way, is becoming, there's now new tools that allow you to get around that limitation. But previously, a lot of us were running Kubernetes on top of Docker so that our CI solutions could run in Kubernetes and then also build images in the Docker underneath. Nowadays, there's other ways you can actually do it inside of Kubernetes without that. But regardless, not going down that rabbit hole. Basically, everybody has their own stuff, and it's all great. And don't worry about it. Use Docker all day long on your local machine. Use Docker on your single server. And then when you need a cluster, use Kubernetes. It'll all be fine.
Yes, definitely. I think a lot of the people think about at that time that how easy, how these are all the details that are hidden away from us from the Docker. There is so much going on underneath when you run the Docker run command. There's so much happening there. So Docker hides away from you, and you just come up with a container come up in a just little amount of time, 30 or 10 or 20 seconds. but there is so much going on underneath. And when eventually this statement came up, then people realized now we have to learn this thing, how actually container is created. And they learned that Kubernetes don't need to manage that because containerd is quite a popular there. Some of the cloud provider also talking about the containerd support, K3s also support the containerd. So there's a lot of these kind moving on. But I think now, right now, we are in 2021, and DockerCon is just going to be ended, and all the people are hosted, and I really enjoy that. So, what's happening in the Docker 2021? What's the cool announcements about Docker, and what's the future roadmap of the Dockers and the containers ecosystem are?
Well, Docker has, as of 2019, so now we've had a year and a half since Docker split, and they've been focused on adding more features to Hub and then enhancing Docker Desktop, and in particular, focusing on adding functionality to the Docker Desktop GUI and rebuilding Docker Compose, which is my favorite Docker tool, rebuilding Docker Compose from the ground up in Go language because it previously was in Python. And in case someone doesn't know, all the container tooling is written in Go for various reasons, but the community really rallied around the Go language. And so Docker, Swarm, Kubernetes, all these things are built in Go. So Docker Compose was one of those tools where it had originally been written in Python 7 years ago and just never got shifted over to Go. So now what they're doing is they're adding it as a Docker command line plugin, and they're adding new functionality and extending it now. So now what we're seeing is even more things you can do with Compose, including doing Docker Compose up against cloud infrastructure. So I like to talk about that, Swarm was almost like the ideas of the previous generation of Docker, the company. Previous ideas were, let's find some servers, install an orchestrator on it, and then manage those servers as one. That's what Swarm and Kubernetes do. But the new Docker thinks, well, we now have in 2021, we have even better cloud APIs for the cloud vendors than we've ever had. So let's stop managing servers. Swarm assumes you manage a server, that you SSH into it and you install Swarm and you manage it and you upgrade it manually and you patch it and all those things. But the cloud now provides us higher level APIs to create auto patching infrastructure, auto replacement infrastructure, auto scaling infrastructure. So now what you see is Docker Compose now has an Azure ACI add-on or plug-in. I'm not sure what the right terminology is, driver, but you can Docker Compose up against ACI. They now do it for AWS's ECS. So you can now Docker Compose up against ECS. And so what you're doing is Docker Compose is now creating the infrastructure, deploying your applications, all using the same Compose file that you know and love. And the next one, I don't know if it's going to be literally the next one, but they're also working on a Kubernetes deployment option. So now you will be able to eventually soon, you'll be able to Docker Compose up against any Kubernetes cluster. And you can see that in the open source. They're kind of building it behind the scenes. And there's not a public beta yet, but that's kind of, I think the future of 2021, 2022 is we will now have Docker Compose for Kubernetes. And Docker's tried that several times before, but this is the first time that they've built it into the Compose tool itself. So we'll have to wait and see for that, but it can be pretty cool.
Yes, definitely. I think that one of the two things you talk about, that's a really interesting for developers, the ACI integration with Azure and ECS integration with AWS, because at the end of the day, you don't need to go there and spun up a new resource in both of these cloud providers and then run the container on that infrastructure. But just using the Docker CLI, everything just built up for you. The infrastructure, the resource manager, the way the application written, where the application reside, in which region, all these things are now managed by Docker using the Docker CLI. And that's developers really appreciated this effort because they have to find the struggling of running the container in the Azure and AWS. But we have to run the Azure and having spun up the infrastructure for running the container there. So I think that's a very good move. We see the Apple ARM chip coming up for Mac support as well. We see a Docker Compose up is now parallel bits also. You can run parallel bits in Docker Compose. So I think the developer tooling is right now the focus of Kubernetes or Docker Swarm right now. So I think we have covered so great things about. I think this is a whole conversation about people who don't know what's happening inside the container ecosystem, how it's evolved, how it's grow, what's happened over the year. So I think that Bret is a personality for me who answered these questions in a very smooth way that people can easily understand and grasp, and really appreciated his time. So one of the
Yeah.
last question that when I let you go, people always talk about during that time, why not is going to be happen there that Kubernetes was just a CRD, and you can run Kubernetes, you can run Docker Swarm inside the Kubernetes using we call the CRD or admission webhook or other kind of contain other criteria. It's never happened there. Why? Because people always talking about we can run Docker Compose inside the Kubernetes. That is a tremendous stuff if we can do that, but it's never happened. What are the reasons you think it's not going to be adopted in such a way?
Well, I think that when you ask people what they love about Swarm, I usually get two answers. One is the ease of infrastructure setup and infrastructure management. So, the Docker Swarm init, Docker Swarm join. So people love that it's easy to set up and deploy. And so the answer to that is let a vendor manage your Kubernetes. Let a vendor provide you the automation and installation tools for Kubernetes. Don't manually do vanilla upstream open source Kubernetes. Use Rancher. Use a cloud vendor. I always recommend a cloud vendor like Fargate, EKS. We've got, everyone has it now, right? DigitalOcean has it. Linode has it. All the smaller cloud vendors, Alibaba, they all have them. And so use those. Every time you can do is use those by default. If you're on-prem and you have to use on-prem, use something like, Rancher's offerings. They've now got the keys offerings, the Ketchup, which is an easy way to deploy Kubernetes on keys. Ketchup, it's spelled differently, but just I guess look it up. So that's really solves that one of the two core loves we had for Swarm. The other thing we loved about Swarm was the ease of deploying our applications. We all love Compose for local use. And so we have this Compose file. It's relatively small. It's usually 100 to 200 lines of YAML versus Kubernetes, which has hundreds and hundreds, or if not thousands of lines of YAML. Most teams I work with, they have many thousands of lines of YAML for Kubernetes. So if Docker Compose in the future can do a Docker Compose up against any Kubernetes API, and I think what it probably will be doing in the background is some sort of Compose to Helm translation, where it sort of automatically creates charts. Maybe I'm speculating a little bit here, but maybe it automatically generates the manifest. It's going to definitely have to do a translation of sort. But if that is there, then that solves the other major thing that we love Swarm for, is ease of application deployment. Now, that gets us like 80% of what we all tended to love about Swarm. Now, granted, there are some things where the commands in Swarm, because they're Docker commands, were way easier than kube control commands. But what we might start to see is Docker Compose add those kind of commands like Docker Compose PS, Docker Compose LS. If you look at the open source, we're already seeing that happen. They're implementing those features for Kubernetes in the Compose command line. So what I think is that Swarm isn't dead. It's just it's getting recreated in this new idea of Compose as the command line tool for the developer to deploy their apps on Kubernetes, on ECS, on ACI, and then eventually these other drivers, probably someday on DigitalOcean apps or other third-party cloud hosting tools. And because every developer at some point has used Docker Compose. Most teams I work with still use Docker Compose locally on their machine. It's still the easiest, most lightweight way to spin up multiple containers with one or two YAML configuration files to describe their entire app stack, right? There's never really been anything else that's captured so many developers. I think Docker said last year something like 800,000 Compose files on GitHub. So there's no other tool that could even touch that. So I think for the foreseeable future, we'll still see Compose being loved. And since Docker is investing a whole team in Compose development, and right now you're seeing there's Compose commits happening like almost every day. So let's hope that they keep adding the features there. And I think what we'll see is think of what they're calling now Compose V2. That's like the next version of Swarm, essentially, because the ideas of Swarm were easy server management, easy application deployment. Server management is getting solved by the vendors. So now what's left is application deployment and management, and maybe Docker Compose can be that tool for a lot of us developers.
Yes, definitely. I think to wrap up all this discussion, it's mean that Docker Swarm is now converting to Docker Compose out in the future, and you can do that same things that you did with Docker Swarm in the past. So before I let you go, I think one question I need to ask you that's really important. Many of the people who are watching your courses like about the content. The one thing I like about your content is that you always keeping your content up to date, never having doing a one Kubernetes course and then we do another course on K3s or micro K8s. You do just focus on one course and then updating that course gradually all the time as the things evolve. So that's I really like about your Docker and Kubernetes course over the Udemy. So what's coming
Thank
up?
you.
What's coming up in this years on these new releases of Kubernetes, and what's your plans of having a new course in the future on this year or might be in the future?
Well, right now I'm in the middle of updating actually all four of my courses, but primarily the Docker Mastery and the Kubernetes Mastery courses. I'm updating all of those to support ARM, specifically for the Apple M1, but then they'll also be able to support Raspberry Pi. So that way you can take the course regardless of what device you're on, because up until recently, almost all of my students would only take it on Intel. There would be on occasion a few people that might take it on a Raspberry Pi, but almost everyone was on Intel. Well, now suddenly, I have an Apple M1, I'm testing it on. And so that's going to be the big thing for this summer, for the next couple of months, is just finally getting there's tons of tools, tons of open source that aren't built for ARM yet. And so I'm working with not just my team, but also the other open source teams that create all this tooling for Docker and Kubernetes. A lot of them don't have ARM versions. So there's another gentleman, Alex Ellis, who creates a lot of great tooling. One that's open, the most well-known one is OpenFast, but he has tons of other great stuff. He has been a huge ARM advocate for years. And so I've actually been learning a lot from him on how to, get all these other open source tools to start building ARM versions. So those of us with an Apple M1 can actually take my courses. I think after that, definitely the courses are going to be updated to the latest version of Kubernetes and the latest version of Docker. I don't have any stuff in there yet about WSL2. So that's going to be coming. The Kubernetes, 121. I'm not sure what exact version I'm going to stick to, but whatever the latest version is when I get ready to ship this thing. And then as we probably go into 2022, what I'll be doing is adding more content to the Docker Mastery course to fill some of the gaps, maybe a little bit more advanced stuff. And that course will get longer because that is my biggest course. So I definitely want to take care of the students there and give them more content. As far as next courses, I have lots of ideas. One of my favorite ideas is to create a generic DevOps course that does no tooling. It's only about people and process, because so many of us get into DevOps and we forget about we don't actually learn the reasons why we even do DevOps. So many courses, they just jump right into Jenkins, and that's not really DevOps. That's a tool that you can use to implement DevOps ideas and DevOps workflows. But I wanted to create a course that was less technical and more about the people and the processes and the workflows and the why, and talk about analytics and measuring and getting feedback and learning and all the things that you have to do. That's why the DevOps symbol is an infinity symbol, because it's a continuous loop. And we often forget about that when we're thinking about Terraform and CI tools and stuff like that. So that's an idea, but I have some stuff written down. I have someone in mind to make that course with, but we haven't done much on it yet. So that's not going to happen this year.
Yes, definitely. I think I love this course as well, because I think we have a lot of confusion around the DevOps. We always talking about the DevOps. We are literally go to the tooling side, never take about that's the process and peoples and the culture, because DevOps is a culture in itself. If you don't adopt your culture and just having the tooling itself, you're never going to be succeeded there. I heard about a lot of stories of the people who are adopting tools and technologies, but they're never successful because their processes and cultures never adopt to the DevOps practices. So I think that's a really great course. I'm looking forward to that. But I really appreciated, Brett, your time. I think it's been a marathon podcast. We did a very, in a small amount of portion, we cover so many things like from 2013 to 2021. Hopefully we cover enough of the information, everybody will be able to hear about that. They're able to know how the containers started, evolve, how the Kubernetes and Docker Swarm competition start, where it's going to happening there, what are the futures of Docker and container and the Kubernetes, GitOps, DevOps. I think we cover so many things with a very, I think, small amount of time. We can keep on talking about these things. I think whole hour, 24 hours, even a month to figure out what's happening about the industry, because this is our hot industry right now.
For sure.
In terms of just Kubernetes and Ingress, we see so many wars coming up. The policy in the service meshes. I think we can keep talking about these things. I think there's a passion for you, or a passion for myself as well, talking about and learning these new technologies. But I really appreciated your time. I hope to catch up you again in this year again in the future podcast as well. I really appreciated your time. It's a dream for me to talking about you all about these things. I've learned over the year from your podcast, your live stream, your courses. You've done a tremendous amount of work in the open source. All your projects, all your efforts are really appreciated. And we are glad to have you a part of a Kubernetes and Dev Docker and a Cloud Native community member. And hope to see you in the DockerCon, the KubeCon. Thank you very much, Brett. Hope everybody liked this podcast. Stay safe, stay healthy, everybody. Hope to catch up you again in the future. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey everybody, if you want to keep up what's going on in the cloud native ecosystem, we have a weekly podcast show on YouTube and SoundCloud by the name of Cloud Native Islamabad. You can listen for free every single week. We try to find cloud and cloud native experts, share updates on cloud native best practices, cloud native real-world use cases, cloud native deployment patterns, cloud native deployment strategies. Topics include AKS on Azure, EKS on AWS, GKE on GCP, cloud native architectures, cloud native application developments, container containerizing application, DevOps and automation, cloud native certification strategies, cloud native career tips, and more. So if that sounds awesome to you, head over to the SoundCloud and YouTube and subscribe to Cloud Native Islamabad.